If you really are a motorsports fan, then I'm sure at one point you've wondered, such as I have, who really is the greatest driver of all time? Well, I decided to use science and stats to set out to figure out just who that is, and the answer may very well surprise you. Just to give you a little bit of background about myself, as many of you don't even know who I am, I got into racing at around the age of 4. I remember my mother turning on a NASCAR race and immediately being fascinated by it. Like many young fans around that age, the big stars of the series immediately drew my attention, and my favorite driver soon became Tony Stewart. He was known for his fierce personality, not afraid to let people know his opinion, and not afraid to get into it with other drivers. However, after several non-NASCAR related incidents, he decided to retire after the 2016 season. Around this time, many other notable NASCAR drivers that I grew up watching started to retire as well, such as Dale Earnhardt Jr. and Jeff Gordon. With the racing slowly becoming lackluster, I transitioned into watching other forms of motorsport, such as IndyCar and F1. Only recently have I gotten back into NASCAR, as once again, new drivers have obtained star power, and the racing is once again pretty good. However, as a fan who watches many different kinds of racing, it got me thinking, who really is the best driver of all time? How do the greats from NASCAR compare to those from F1, and how do those compare to the greats of IndyCar and Aussie supercars? It's so often that motorsports fans get trapped in their own little bubbles, not paying much attention to the history or drivers in other series. Apart from driver swaps or PR stunts, we never really hear much about other series. But today, that all changes. Today I set out to figure out who the best driver of all time is, not just from F1, but from every series that has ever existed. One of the most important factors to look at is the difference between each of the main types of motorsport. NASCAR, WRC, F1, and endurance racing all differ wildly from one another, so comparing drivers which have only competed in one of those respective sports is difficult. In an ideal world, everyone would be like Juan Pablo Montoya, a driver who has competed in both of NASCAR's top 2 series, Formula 1, kart, IndyCar, ARCA, as well as several endurance racing series. While there are several other notable drivers that are like this, including Jacques Villeneuve, Mario Andretti, and Robbie Gordon, the majority of drivers tend to stick to their respective side of motorsports. This makes comparing drivers from different backgrounds difficult, such as comparing Dale Earnhardt to Ayrton Senna. Both drivers were incredibly talented and dominated their respective series, but never once competed head-to-head, despite racing at the same time. While we may have potentially seen Ayrton Senna in the US of A, as he had previously stated that he would be interested in joining IndyCar after F1, both drivers unfortunately passed away before we could see this happen. So, I did my best to try and level the playing field, as each type of racing is different. I decided to adjust each driver's average finish based on the field size, as finishing 15th is a much greater feat in NASCAR, where the field sizes are typically at around 40 cars. Compare this to finishing 15th in F1, and it's a completely different picture, as that would be considered to be a bad finish by all means, where the field is only a mere 20 cars. Now, for the sake of keeping things organized, I have decided not to include rally drivers on this list, as I was not sure how to quantify their results in a way that would be comparable to everything else I have. So sorry, Sebastian Loeb, I know that you're an amazing driver, but you're not going to be making this list. However, with that being said, I did my best to compile data from each of the major series and from their feeder series if the data was available. This data was then broken down into several categories. These categories are number of races run, number of wins, win percentage, number of podiums, podium percentage, number of top 5 finishes, top 5 finish percentage, number of top 10 finishes, top 10 finish percentage, number of poles, pole percentage, average finish, and finally, average finish percentage. This last category is based on how far forward a driver finishes in a given field. For example, my favorite driver growing up, Tony Stewart, had an average finish of 14.1 during his NASCAR Cup Series career. Out of the standard 40-car field in NASCAR, this means that he averaged a finish in the top 35.25% of all cars in any given race throughout his career. Definitely not too shabby. Each of these statistics are then all put together in a final total category, where a driver's statistics from each of the series that they raced in are averaged together. This can be both a blessing and a curse, as drivers who had success in one series, such as Juan Pablo Montoya in Formula 1 and IndyCar, may have their career statistics significantly hurt by a failure in another. For example, Despite good finishes in other series, Montoya obtained only 2 wins in 255 races in the NASCAR Cup Series, resulting in a measly 0.78% career win percentage. Yikes. Another notable factor that unfortunately cannot be accurately quantified is how dominant a specific team is, and how much that may benefit a driver. 2 good examples of this are Jimmy Johnson and Lewis Hamilton. Not to say that either driver isn't extremely talented, as both clearly are, but there is no denying that their teams were consistently giving them the best equipment in their respective series. I mean, just look at how dominant Mercedes has been, and how Jimmy dominated when he won 5 championships in a row. These are factors that should be considered, but also by no means should take away from a driver's accomplishments, as a good car still needs a good driver to win. With that being said, it is still very interesting to compare drivers that otherwise would not be considered at all in the best of all time conversation. By leveling out the playing field and considering drivers from all, or at least from most, walks of life, a broader and more complete picture can be painted. Drivers who would otherwise go unnoticed suddenly stick out, such as Scott Dixon, Bobby Unser, and even Kyle Busch. In fact, in my research, no other driver had more total wins across all series than Kyle Busch, who has so far amassed 216 wins throughout his career. This, however, also brings me to one of the other issues with the usual greatest of all time candidates. They often have very low race counts. Take, for example, Juan Manuel Fangio, who is often considered by many to be the de facto greatest of all time. Throughout his F1 career, he only raced in 51 races, placing him 59th out of all drivers that I researched. Alberto Ascari is in a similar situation, having only raced in 32 races throughout his F1 career. While the talent that these two had is undisputable, it is hard to say that they really were the best, as there just isn't enough data to really say that accurately, not to mention the fact that F1 was still in its infantile stages at the time. But with that being said, let's look at some of the best drivers from each of the specific series, before getting into the final results and deciding who really is the best of all time. Let's start things off with NASCAR. NASCAR has 3 main series, each of which has their own set of greats. The Cup Series is NASCAR's de facto top-tier series, followed by the Xfinity Series, which is basically NASCAR's equivalent to F2 or Indy Lights, and then by the NASCAR Truck Series. However, unlike F2 and IndyCar, Cup Series drivers often compete in Xfinity and Truck Series races, making for sometimes unbalanced fields. Think of Lewis Hamilton or Max Verstappen dropping down to race in F2 or F3 races just because they can, competing with young and inexperienced drivers who are still trying to make their way up to the big leagues. This imbalance was most notable in 2006, as Cup Series drivers won all but 2 of the Xfinity Series races that year. With that short breakdown over though, let's look over each of NASCAR's 3 main series and see just who comes out on top. Beginning with the NASCAR Cup Series, many of the classic drivers such as David Pearson and Richard Petty immediately stick out. However, while they may be up for debate as the GOAT of NASCAR, with little to no notable success in other series, it's hard to put them ahead of drivers like Tony Stewart and AJ Foyt, who excelled in other series as well as in NASCAR. In my opinion, the best of all time should be a driver who is capable of driving just about anything and having relative success. Unfortunately for a lot of NASCAR drivers, a similar problem to those in F1 crops up, where they just simply do not have enough experience outside of their specific type of motorsport to really gauge how effective of a driver they are. With that being said though, let's look at the top 10 drivers in each of the major statistical categories, as well as take a look at some of the drivers that may not have broken into the top 10, but made up for it in other ways, or through success in other series. Let's start with the most basic category, career wins. Here you can see that the King reigns supreme with his 200 career Cup Series wins, one of motorsport's unbreakable records. This does need to be taken with a grain of salt, however, as many of the drivers on this list have very little experience outside of NASCAR, making it difficult to say if they really are the best of all time. Numerous times we have seen how drivers who excelled in one series have failed in another discipline, and without any data showing how they would have fared in another series, it is hard to say whether they really were the best of all time. If we limit our selection to only drivers who have competed across multiple disciplines, then our list looks like this. Jeff Gordon now reigns supreme, followed closely by Bobby Allison, Jimmy Johnson, and Cale Yarborough. Other notable drivers that sneak onto the list include Tony Stewart, Mark Martin, and Carl Edwards. And for those of you F1 fans who don't know who he is, he's this guy.
So, Carl Edwards versus the mighty Michael. I think I've got to go for Michael Schumacher, but Edwards is reasonably handy. But then again, he's used to ovals. Let's see how he copes with the curves here. And we kind of be able to gauge a little by the gap between them. That's healthy, I've got to say.
It seemed to reward a very, very tidy, tight driving style. They're front-wheel drive, supercharged, so it's quite easy to make the car understeer and push on.
How's about that?
Carl Edwards is well in front.
Well, he's on target to do it right now. He just has to drive this one home. And Carl Edwards is heading for victory here. It may be something of surprise to many of you. I'm sure there are people screaming at the screen saying, for goodness sake, Carl Edwards is a massive NASCAR talent. Well, we know he is, but we expected that Michael would, well, certainly by his demeanor early on. Look at this. It's a huge margin of victory, and here comes Carl Edwards to do it for the United States. What about that?
Well,
he beats Michael Schumacher by 1.74 seconds. Tremendous.
However, raw win totals don't really prove much in terms of a driver's success over a career. So instead, let's mix things up and look at each driver's total career win percentage instead. The list now changes to look like this, with Dan Gurney moving to the top of the leaderboard. However, drivers whose names are highlighted in red indicate that they have less than 25 career starts in a given series. This is just precautionary, as with so few starts it can be hard to judge just how successful a driver is in any given series. With the exception of Dan Gurney, Mark Donohue, and Mario Andretti, each of these drivers made over 100 career NASCAR Cup Series starts, meaning that we have a pretty good idea about just how they were in NASCAR. Other notable drivers that competed in NASCAR as well as other series include AJ Foyt, Kyle Larson, Robbie Gordon, Marcus Ambrose, Juan Pablo Montoya, Johnny Rutherford, Danica Patrick, Sam Hornish Jr., Scott Speed, Dario Franchitti, Al Unser, Bobby Unser, Jacques Villeneuve, and Jim Clark. While those last 5 drivers had the excuse of running very few events, the top 5 drivers all drove full-time in the Cup Series, and came from numerous backgrounds. Patrick, Hornish, and Gordon were all IndyCar race winners, and both Montoya and Speed had competed in F1 prior to joining NASCAR. However, with none of these drivers posting a win percentage any higher than 6%, it is difficult to say that any of them really had a successful career in NASCAR. Even when going by a top 10 finish percentage, it doesn't get much better for these drivers. In fact, if we only include the aforementioned multidisciplined drivers, this is what the results look like when going by a top 10 finish percentage. Again, Gurney, Allison, Gordon, and Yarborough sit near the top, while other notable drivers such as Tony Stewart and Bobby Unser also make the list. For the other notable candidates whose stats weren't mentioned above, here's how they pan out, with Carl Edwards leading the rest of the drivers. Finally, let's take a look at a driver's average finish numbers, as I felt as though pole percentage statistics weren't all that important in NASCAR. Statistically, here were the top 10 drivers who raced in multiple disciplines during their Cup Series careers. Before going into how the rest of the drivers fared, I think it is important to state for all of the non-NASCAR fans out there that a typical NASCAR field is around 40 cars, so anything above 20th is relatively pretty good, although a top 10 finish is typically viewed as ideal. With that being said though, here are how the other notable drivers fared. In case you're wondering where Jacques Villeneuve is, in the 4 Cup Series races that he started, he averaged a finish of 33.0. He isn't the only former F1 driver to struggle in NASCAR though, as Scott Speed also averaged an average finish position outside the top 30. They aren't the only open-wheel drivers to have a difficult time transitioning however, as the peek into NASCAR's just as competitive feeder series will quickly point out. The Xfinity Series is NASCAR's de facto second tier, and just like the Cup Series, is open to all drivers. It's not uncommon for Cup Series drivers to drop down and regularly race in the Xfinity and Truck Series, which can make for some very exciting racing, and for some very unbalanced fields. With that being said, however, let's take a deep dive into how some of these multidimensional drivers have fared in NASCAR's second tier. Kyle Busch reigns supreme here, dominating all active and past drivers with an astonishing 97 career Xfinity Series wins. However, because the Xfinity Series is essentially optional for Cup Series drivers, his large margin between him and the next highest driver, Carl Edwards, should be taken with a grain of salt, as Busch has raced in over 120 more races than Carl has in the series. As for the remaining drivers, here is how their stats fare. If we shift our focus from outright number of wins to win percentage, we begin to get a better idea of just how successful certain drivers are in the Xfinity Series. Kyle Busch stays on top with a staggering 27.17% win percentage, meaning that over his Xfinity Series career, he has managed to average a win in roughly every 4 races. Regardless of the level of competition, this type of domination shouldn't go unnoticed. Montoya's struggle in the Cup Series gets a little better, as he gets bumped up to 9th with a 4.35% win percentage. Still, the struggles of the ex-F1 drivers continue, with Jacques Villeneuve and Scott Speed struggling to get a single win in NASCAR's second division. Before moving on to the final NASCAR series, the Truck Series, let's look at each of the drivers' top 10 finish percentage, as well as their average final finishing position. Unlike the previous 2 categories, Chase Elliott tops the charts when it comes to finishing in the top 10, managing to finish in the top 10 every 4 out of 5 races. Jacques Villeneuve also sees his fortunes change, as he averaged a top 10 finish in about 2/3 of the races he started. Here is how the other drivers fared. Arguably the most notable surprise on this list is Jimmie Johnson, who was never quite able to recreate his Cup Series success in NASCAR's lower divisions. Finally, however, here is how each of the above drivers fared in terms of average finishing position. Once again, Chase tops the list, with Kyle Busch being a close second. It's also interesting to see Jacques Villeneuve so high, as he was never known for his success in NASCAR. Even if he never won a race, it becomes clear that he at least had the talent to stay competitive. Finally, let's move on to NASCAR's last major series, the Truck Series. The Truck Series is a bit different from the Cup and Xfinity Series, as instead of running stock cars, they use large trucks as their base. However, this does not take away from the difficulty of conquering an oval, and those that could successfully do that are as follows. Similar to the Xfinity Series, Kyle Busch is on top, and it isn't even close. However, due to it being NASCAR's third tier, and the cars being somewhat different to those in the Cup Series, fewer notable drivers chose to race in this series, leaving us with a much smaller pool of drivers to select from. Other notable drivers that have competed in the Truck Series but have not won a race are as follows. That alone is a pretty significant list, with some rather large names never finding much success in the series, albeit with only a handful of starts. Once again though, let's take a look at each driver's win percentage to get a better idea of how successful each driver was when it came to providing results on the track. In my personal opinion, the most notable driver here is Tony Stewart, who managed to win 2 races in just 6 career Truck Series starts. This only further helps improve his status as a driver who can win in just about anything, as we'll touch on later in the series. With such a small pool of drivers to choose from, I've decided to skip over the top 10 finish percentage, and instead go straight to the average finish position instead. The results here are as follows. Of course, with only 4 drivers starting more than 25 races, it is hard to accurately say that these statistics give a good estimate of one's ability. They do, however, show just how difficult it can be to transfer from the road course to the oval, as former F1 drivers such as Jacques Villeneuve, Narain Karthikeyan, and Scott Speed all found little success in the Truck Series. With this being said, however, in Part 2, we'll be shifting our focus to open wheel cars, with notable series including Formula 1 and IndyCar. We'll also be taking a look at endurance racing as well as several other major series around the world. And finally, the moment we're all waiting for. Who really is the best driver of all time? Find out in Part 2, coming soon. I would just like to say a quick shout out to both the IndyCar and NASCAR subreddits for showing great support and providing feedback during the research phase of this video. I'd also like to thank all of you guys for liking the video and subscribing, and I'd like to point out that I do have a Patreon as well, so if you'd like to check that out and support me, the link will be down below in the description. Take care, guys.